So if you
Okay.
haven't, if you're not following Antoinette, she's got a great Twitter handle called Kicking Apps.
All right, so can you see my screen there?
Yes, we
And
can.
is it on the component library, Microsoft Docs?
Yep.
Only in
Okay.
dark mode.
Yes, it's in dark mode, so I hope that's not a problem there.
No, you're
And
good.
thank you. Thanks for asking me to speak at this initial inaugural event. I appreciate it. So I was asked to speak to components, and I want to just share a few that I created, some that are more common that you can use in most apps like loading screen or loading spinners, that sort of thing, dialog boxes. And then I'll show some ways that I've gotten creative using the components. And when I'm talking about components, I'm talking about Canvas components specifically, not the component framework, Power Apps component framework. So keep that in mind. So as with all things, there's plenty of documentation out there. Refer to the Microsoft Docs screen to learn more about components and learn just how to do a basic, simple walkthrough of creating a component. Another great resource is the Reusable Components blog put out by Medi. And this has some great components, many that I refer to, especially as I've been learning how to integrate components into my own apps. So he offers a variety here, and you can download the package or single components at GitHub. So just two great resources for your reference. I have, within my component library, created 4 for this demo that I want to share with you guys today. And I'll start out with the simplest, which is a loading spinner. The great thing about component libraries, which is fairly new and recent, is that any changes you make here within this component library, wherever you have that component, in whatever app you have that component, if you make a change, that component, that change will be pushed through to all the apps that have that component. So we'll start out with a loading spinner, very simple. This one has an image and a background filter. So within this component, one that is often used for a loading screen in my apps is I use loading spinners quite a bit, or some kind of indicator. So within a component, it's very similar to creating an app. The great thing is that you have the ability to create your own custom properties, and this is how you will talk to the component. You'll have the option to create inputs and outputs from your component, and we'll go through that a little bit more later. But for now, I just wanted to show something that's used frequently. It's common, and it's a great thing to learn how to create a loading or a loading spinner or loading indicator, because then if you use it, you can just use it throughout all your apps, and it's already created. You don't have to go through the process every time you create a new app. So walk through it. I put in a loading spinner, put in an image, and save it and publish it. The only input I have for this particular component is the input property, which is called image spinner, and this is what my image is. If I have another image that I want to use, all I have to do when I integrate this component into my app is refer to whatever media that is, and that media is stored in the in your media category. Hold on, something's okay. So if you view, you would store whatever media you want for your loading spinner there. Once that component is created, you just bring it into whatever app you're working on. And I'll bring that in here to show you that, to demonstrate that. So in this demo app, oh, I'm sorry. Get there. In this demo app, I simply went to this icon and selected the option. If you do not see your components here, you select get more components. What that does is that opens up to your component library, and it will display whatever is not in your app currently. So that's where you would refer to access those components that you've created. So in my case, I already have that component within this app, but once you bring it here into your tools, then you go into your screen, and that's where you add the component that you want to access. So now I have a loading spinner within my screen on my first screen of my app. And what I'll show you, and forgive me, the layout isn't great, but that's because of something I'm going to demo later. But that simple component, now if you had a button, in my case, I just threw a toggle in and on off. So you would set a variable to show the component, and it's that simple. So any app you go to, you throw this component in there, you set a variable to show that component. When a user submits a record and you want to give them a little indicator, for example, then you would set a variable on a button. Submit is most common, and once they submit, the loading spinner would become visible and probably on a timer or something, and then you could reset that variable. That's a very simple component. Another common one is a dialogue.
Do you ever trick anybody with your Power Apps and just put loading screens there when they should be interacting with it? I
No,
would love to text people that.
I have not done that.
I think this is a great centralized way to just like have I kind of think of it like in Power BI where you have like certified data sets or shared data sets. The components is a great way to kind of centralize your teamwork and, you know, be able to kind of work off of a way. So then you have a very cohesive Power Apps all throughout your organization using the same pieces.
Exactly, and that's really handy when you have branding things that you must follow for your organization or things along those lines. Or if you just want to create that uniformity that you're speaking about, it's, you know, if you create these, you share these with your team, folks that are also creating Power Apps. This is a great thing, and also the time it saves, of course. So another common one is the dialogues, to let your users know what's going on, get that confirmation, do you want to delete that record, etc. And as you can see in this one, there is more custom properties. And this is another one that I downloaded from that site that I shared with Medi, that showed those 10 reusable components. So you can see here that there are more, these are inputs, and then there's also the output. So this is how the component and the screen that is housing the component speak back and forth. This can get tricky, and so especially the more complex the components become. What I often do when I dig into a component, create my own, go out to learn from someone else's, is I create my own map, and using whiteboard, you know, set out my screen, what's doing what at which step, and how are they talking to each other. So for me, this is a really helpful way to see what's happening, because
That's amazing.
I can find it a little dizzying, try to learn what's speaking to what and how within the component. So I'll break it down and sort of reverse engineer it this way first using Microsoft Whiteboard. And
I
that's
love
what I did.
Whiteboard, by the way. Whiteboard is
Oh,
sweet.
it's fantastic. And people who don't use it and you use it in a Teams meeting think it's magic. So yeah, I agree. So that's what I did here. So this is for the dialogue app that I'm sharing. So when somebody selects the button on the home screen, that's what sets the variable to show the component, and then it just maps its way through, as you can see there. So when you create these, you have many options for your inputs, for your custom properties, and you can walk through and see what, so here's just simply true, false. You can use images, tables, I haven't used video or audio. I do use the color. Screen is great when you start to create some navigation for your apps and you want a uniform menu throughout, and this helps you to set that up so that people can navigate back and forth throughout your screen and the menu remains consistent. So this is where you would create those custom properties and set your themes or your colors. And what's great here is, I'll show you, is in the overlay color. Right now it's just, it's set in your component as a sort of a default. This is what it comes default. But once you bring it into your app, that's where you can customize some of these things. And that's where the power is in being reusable. So for example, in this app now, I've moved out of the component that I created in the component library, and I'm going to move into an app where I brought this component in, showing you earlier using this menu here. So now that I have this dialog component in my app, you can see that here. And it's essentially just the one item. Everything is inside it, but the properties that where you might customize this component are available to you on the right or within the menu here. So if you use the same dialog component for, maybe you use it when somebody wants to delete a record and you want a confirmation, you could put this component in your app and you could say confirm delete and type your message here, whatever that may be. And in this app, my color theme is more greens. So that's where you have, where there's a lot of power is. You can customize it once it's created and use the same component in different screens. So if I added the same component from the component library into another screen, but it was not a confirm delete message, I would want it to say maybe, are you sure you want to close or something?
And just a quick thing to add, Brenton asked if the dialog component responds to theme changes, and Chuck said it does, based on themes.
All right. So, so that's how you, that's a great way to use components. I had an app early that I created and had 6 screens, created a menu for each screen with the local icons for home, the navigation icons, and that's before components. And so when we went back to use that app a year later as a conference app, and they asked for some modifications, I had to go through each of those screens to modify those menus because I didn't have a component in that app, which is very time consuming. So had I had a component, I could have made the change simply in the component. And then when I reopened the app, it would ask me to, if I want to implement that change, you say yes, and now the changes are made.
Awesome. And somebody else asked, if you're able to use images in your component library, I think specific to like company branding, I think you had mentioned that as a use case.
Yes, and I believe I actually closed the app that has the image, but here, let me show you actually. So on this spinner app, or I'm sorry, loading spinner, I have this image here, but if I wanted to change this image, I could come in and add an image, and that's what the image then. So that is, you can dynamically change that once you build the component. As long as you create this custom property, that's the key. Now, if you put the image directly inside of, or I did close it, if you had the component and you put that specific image and didn't create the custom property for it, then no, you would have to go in to your component and change that image each time.
So
but
that
by
custom
creating the custom
property helps actually store it, huh?
Yes, and it actually makes it so that if you wanted to use this component, I shared it with you, you want an image of what's on the logo on your shirt, and I want the loading spinner, all you have to do is go into, once you integrate it into your app, and you just have to upload it in your media files. and I refer to it here in your property. And that's what image would be displayed for your app specifically.
Awesome. Thank you.
And so here I'll show you where this is in, again, ignore the layout. This is, so as you can see, another common use, you would set a button with a variable to show whatever that component is and make that visible and put your code behind that so that you have the actions there that you need when that component's displayed. So those are two common uses for components. I think they're great places to start, and I definitely recommend getting familiar with creating components because they will save a lot of time in the end. For myself, I have found that creating my own custom properties and understanding how those work has taken a little bit of time. So that's where I use Whiteboard quite a bit to make sure that I am learning how to map everything. What is the inputs? So what are we feeding into? And here's your input and your output. What is coming into the app? And what do I need from the app that needs to be available within the screen? And that's your outputs. And again, that's where I find this practice to be very helpful. I'll pause real quick. I felt like that was good coverage of things that many people see often when you use apps, good use cases for, and then I can show some other ways that I use them for designing and creating responsive apps, some tricks and a little more advanced stuff. If there aren't any questions or you don't want to see anything more on these two screens.
So I think just to help fully clarify, we're kind of going back to the whole question about the custom property and the image. Is the image actually stored in the app or in the component?
Well, in this case, I have an image stored in the component, and I did upload into the media files. Now, let me see here. Oh, I'm in the dialogue one. Let me get back. I'm sorry. So for this loading screen, I did save that particular image in my media file, and that is what I refer to in my case for.
Got it.
However, though, if I shared this with you, you would have access to that particular image, but if you do not want to use it, you could upload your own image into your app and use whatever image that is that you want to use.
Got
So
it.
if you
Thank
wanted
you
another, sure. So if you wanted another spinner or another GIF of some sort, then you would simply add that to your own app and refer to it within your app.
Does anybody else have any questions that they want to chime in with? Oh, waiting. I don't know, Antoinette. I really love the visual you provided on, kind of how you walk through just the logic of your app. Do you want to maybe just give a quick flyover on how you set that up so, others that are looking to build a Power App, they can kind of have that same mental map that you do?
This whiteboard example, is that what you're
Yeah, I think that's a
saying?
fantastic example.
Sure. So this is started again from those components that I downloaded. And what I do is first I'll refer to what are the inputs and the outputs of the component. So this is everything that's coming into the component from the app, from the screen that you embed this in. And this is what is going out. And within these, or for those properties, you'll have to search around and see what's happening. So, for example, this, when a user selects the buttons within the dialog, what happens here? So that's where those variables are coming in. So I dig in and pull all of that information out. And then I sort of try to color code my sketch to say, for all of the inputs, you can see there what is happening. So when this button in the screen is selected, it sets a variable. What's happening with this variable? Well, this variable is the visibility. This sets the visibility by toggling. There's a toggle in the component itself. And if this custom property called open close is set to true, this toggle then defaults to true. So one of the inputs for the dialog component is called open close. The value of open close, the true false value of open close, comes from the show hide variable. Let me show you that. This is the tricky part to explain. Okay. So here in my screen now, I'm out of the component. I brought the component into my screen. And I have my dialog selected. You see the custom property, which is a true false, open close, here on the right menu. And if I select that, what triggers this to true or false? It is my variable show hide, which is set on the button that is within the screen, not within the component. This is on my screen. So this, selecting this button, sets a variable show hide, which I then make that input and feed into my component by putting that variable on this custom property. This is why I sketch it out, because it takes a little bit to try to grasp how all of these things work together. So what does open close do? Well, open close sets the value of the toggle. So if it's true, then this toggle turns true. And that is what then sets the visibility of the component on the screen. So by toggling this to true, this toggles to true, and this visibility appears on the screen. Once I select a button within the gallery from the component on the menu of cancel or OK, it sets the toggle to false, which then changes the properties so that it no longer is visible. So you can see I do this for all of the inputs. What happens first? What does that do? Once I select this, what happens on that screen? And then it helps me to understand what's going on, what variable is affecting which property for all of the custom properties that are created. And in some cases, this list, that you can go on quite a bit. So that's where it really gets tricky in my mind to keep clear what's going on. I don't know if that helps.
But, I think that's really nice.
Yeah, so it's still hard to explain, and it takes me a while trying to map it and clicking through as I'm mapping it to see what variables are being set. I'll throw a lot of labels on there so that I can see what's happening when things are selected, for example, in the dialog menu here, what's happening, what variables. So if I see all those variables, I'll throw labels in so that I can look at all those variables and when they're being triggered as well. So that's kind of sums up how I start, where I utilize them in the more common ways as far as menus, home screen menus, contact us menus, that sort of thing. I use components quite a bit for that. And dialogues, it's great creating the dialogues and reusing and just slapping them into mini screens. You can use the same component, this dialogue component, on every screen, or 4 different ways here within the same screen if you wanted to.
Do you ever get snarky with your dialogue boxes?
No, I don't. No, I haven't done that.
Great UI practice. Are you sure you want to do this? Because I do not agree. Or like, I don't know. Make the app fun, but it's probably why
Yeah,
I'm
I
not.
haven't done. I worked on some apps for fun, but not anything with the dialogue. So.
Got it.
So yeah, so those are great ones to start with. They're great ones that are quite reusable and to refer back to. So I wanted to start there, and then if you're ready, we can go on, or if there's any other questions, happy to.
I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think let's go to your next topic.
So another way that I've used components, and this is where you can start to get creative with utilizing components, is if anybody has done any work with responsive design, it's tricky, it's tedious, very time consuming. So what I have done is created a couple of components that help me with responsive design and to simplify it as much as possible. So let me show you first how I utilize a responsive grid, a fluid grid for designing my apps and simplify the process. So this grid, of course, isn't visible to the users. I use it strictly for designing my apps and as a reference point. Rather than trying to figure out if you've done any work with this, a lot of times it's percentages from, X. If you want a button at this X value in responsive, you might say app.width times 0.25 to get it 25% in from the X axis. What I have now is I have a component that resizes based on the screen it is on, and my grid here that I refer to for placing elements or controls will resize accordingly. So this is fairly simple. The key for this component is the collection that I use, and it's dynamic, so it adjusts as the screen size changes. So on change of this slider, I am collecting and calculating, essentially, those columns and gutters is what they're called. And I'll show you this in action. So you can see behind this is what's creating the collection. And how I use this is I bring it into my app here. And you can see now my grid. This is fluid. So as the screen size changes, those columns and gutters adjust to fit the screen size based on the breakpoints. So
we had a quick question. Is it best practice to use the parent width or the app width when you're designing this responsive app?
I use the app width and the component width. So once it's in the screen, I use app width because I remove this component from the app. I bring it in, use it for my design work. The calculations are not within the component. They're on that slider that is hidden on the app. So I use app width for that purpose. And how I use this, you can see, so if I have a screen that I have defined as extra large and horizontal layout, maybe I want to place this or have this button placed at column, right now it's set to column 4 and I want it at column 5, then I can adjust that in my formulas. And this is within the X property or the formula on the button itself once I design it. But I put these labels in input boxes here so you can see what I'm doing. But utilizing this grid, that's how I can place my controls so that they are dynamic. So if I was designing this app, for example, and I knew I wanted I have a screen that's defined as extra large and in horizontal layout, I would look at where do I want to place this button. And this is how I can test how that might look. So in this case, I like it there. I like it at the location it's at, but I don't really like that seems a little bit offset here. And I want to make it expand out to this next gutter. So I can do that and get a reference for how that will look by using this grid. And then if I minimize this a little further, now I have a screen that is more, it's a little bit smaller, defined in my calculation as large horizontal. And I feel like now the button is too small. I want it to expand out, but I don't know how far out. So I can test that out here. And I can say, well, I still like it where it's at, which is column 5, but I think it should be a little bit wider. And so what would that look like? So maybe that's how I would like that to look in this layout, and then on throughout my app. So here I can see it's off the screen if I left it in calculation set to what it's at right now. So I would maybe want to move it in, and I want to minimize it. So this is more to show you how I utilize the grid. The calculations are a whole different story on placing these elements. But to give you an idea of another way to use a component in your app that is outside of the traditional idea of using components. And to take this a little further, to simplify that even more for that responsive design and still speak to components, is I've created a component that's a design component to simulate screen sizes that I'm designing for. So let me zoom in here, give you an idea. Still the grid idea. And here I have a drop down, and within this drop down, all those screen sizes that I am designing for, I can adjust my component here to create and mirror that type of screen size. So if I'm creating an app and I want to see how is it going to look if it's a small and in portrait mode, how will things look on that app? I can utilize my grid that I've created and use a component to simulate that screen size that I'm designing for. And so then I would come in here and say, well, I know I'm going to want to place this item if it's in this view. at column 1, the x-axis, and I want to have a control in this location, but this is, the height is a little bit too high for me, so I think what I'll do is I'll bring it to about, that looks good, so about 40% of the app's height. That's what this calculation is doing, and I don't really like it there. I want it right there, and so that's about at 35% of the app's height for the on the y-axis. So once I have that all set, I will have my actual app that I'm designing open, and I have two screens going, where I have my simulator screen and then the app I'm designing, and then I will enter those formulas for that control. Once I have this particular screen designed, I will see what it looks like in the other layout. And that's where I'll adjust my layout on my simulator screen. And then I will go into my actual app that I'm designing, and I will enter those formulas so that they'll take effect in the actual app.
That is
And
pretty slick.
And so I'll do this for all the breakpoints that I'm designing for. And
Do you
it just
often
helps.
have multiple tabs open while you're developing so you can make these toggling easier? Or?
I do for this because this is just this screen simulator is just, I just throw stuff here. I don't do any design in here. This is just simply for my reference. And then I have another tab open in another screen, and that's where I can take the values that I have worked into this simulator screen for the, say, for example, the height percentage, and I can then go into my actual screen and enter those values. And when it's all said and done, I'll go to my app and remove the grid, but everything holds because the calculations are actually on the slider. So even though I'm referring to column 1 or place this item at column 4, even when I remove the grid and there's not actually column 4 that you can see visually, it is there within the calculation itself. So that's where I establish my positions for those values, is here on the slider. So that's a little more advanced, tricky. And then lastly, I'll just show you how that looks in an app I've actually created and used that grid. And you have Tim here on the call, and I mentioned earlier that Tim has helped me figure out quite a bit with some math and some calculations. So this is an app I've been working on, and I've created this image grid here. And as you can see in this case, I'll turn on the grid. And in this layout, I have this control set to column 4's X value. So you can see that here. And as I begin to shrink this, minimize my screen a little bit, it sticks to that location, that X value on the axis. And it'll continue to adjust. And then as I continue to go in, you'll see this is now considered a vertical layout, large vertical layout. So the menu now is down below, and think of this as in portrait mode. And I adjusted where this control is. So before it was at the column 4 X value, but if I were in a large vertical portrait mode, I would like it instead at column 3's X axis. So you can see that that adjusted accordingly. And then as I move in even further and imagine more of an iPhone here, you can see now it is adjusted to simply 2 columns for the image grid, and it expands a little wider throughout the screen. So, so that, you know, takes components to another level where you can get creative and utilize it in other ways to help with your own app design and creation.
Who's that puppy? You got to tell us all.
Oh yeah, that's our dog Jack. He's about 1.5 years and drives everyone crazy until the end of the day when he curls up in someone's lap, and then we all love him.
Forget about it. So cute. Such a cute
Yeah,
puppy.
thanks. So I hope
Wow.
that was helpful. Again, I recommend digging into those components and definitely working with them to integrate them into your apps so that it saves a lot of time in the long run.
I think that was spectacular, Antoinette. A great set of suggestions. So many great things to take away from learning takeaways. Does anybody have questions with the last 10 minutes that we have on any of the number of different component methods that Antoinette was sharing? Or was it just so amazing, left everybody speechless? I think you just left everybody speechless.
Well, I
Seeing a bunch of
appreciate the
people.
opportunity to share, and I'm happy, you know, you mentioned my Twitter handle, and happy to help out. I've received a lot of help along the way, and if I can help, definitely would love to. So let me know.
Power of community. And Antoinette, thanks for always, submitting to the forums. I know you're so active, such an active member of the community. So thanks for all your efforts.